Hello, Something Guys and Gals. This is Something Guy 912. A bit uncouth and abrupt of a topic for me to bring up, but given my propensity to talk about a myriad of random subject matter, both old and new, both irrelevant and reverent, of course something like this would follow. I've had a real thorn in my side in the way that radio stations attempt to make songs radio friendly, either for the sake of the parents or for the sake of the record labels. Whether that is the nature of how they decide to make a song more radio friendly, the inconsistent and frankly antiquated nature of its methodology, or even how attempting to do so makes the song more grotesque as a result. I should start this little tangent with a disclaimer. I am not trying to argue that there should not be a means of which to make a song more palatable in the off chance some child is in the car with you. My grievances with the nature of this soft censorship has everything to do with how it is done and how the result makes the exact opposite result of its intentions. In the same way that people complain about the TOS guidelines for platforms like YouTube and Twitch, it has everything to do with the consistency of the rules they are enforcing rather than the rules in of themselves. So with that disclaimer, let's go through a few examples of this attempt to think about the children. The first and usually most common example of this is the nuclear option, a full omittance of the word in question. The usual problem with doing this is that it causes a Streisand effect for the listener, where in any other context the word would flow through a sentence in a song naturally. Its absence puts more emphasis on it than was intended. A few examples that come to note is Panic at the Disco's I Write Sins Not Tragedies and Tool's Sober, where the words goddamn and fucking are omitted in moments of the chorus or the bridge, parts of a song where a listener would be most intent on listening to. The abrupt way in which a singer is cut short before diving right back in may not pull a listener out of the experience, but regardless, their brain will notice the discrepancy. There have been more recent songs that attempt to fill that gap in songs, like how in All Time Low's Monsters, the chorus section replaces the phrase fuck up to ruin in its radio friendly version, and in fact, I honestly prefer the latter because the delivery of ruin is more fluid than the former. I don't mind if you fuck up my life. I don't mind if you ruin my life. The more pressing problem with this nuclear option is that while it does take away the obscenity, it doesn't take away the context for that obscenity being used, and once again, puts more onus on its presence as a result of its absence. An example of this is in Everclear's What It's Like. We'll get back to this song again soon enough, where there's a stanza verse talking about a woman who fell in love with a man up until she got pregnant and the man ran out on her, and the word balls is cut, pun intended, at the end of a rhyme regarding what she'll do to him if she sees him again. Absence or no, everyone who listens to this line knows exactly what she's saying, so unless you cut out the entire line, or even the line before it leading into the end rhyme, no amount of cutting that word will change anything. The only example I can think of where an entire stanza of a verse was ever cut for radio-friendly sakes was the Dire Straits' Money for Nothing, where the stanza of the band talking about faggots was cut in favor of a instrumental break. In fact, you'd probably be more familiar with this version of the song given the age of the song, unless you were looking for it, and the only reason I know about this was because of an Amazing Atheist video bringing it up years ago. But regardless, that would be the only way to cut out the context of who they're referring to. It wouldn't make much difference if they had only bleeped the word faggot in its lines. Let's also talk about how even the nuclear option fails to even omit certain things it probably should, and only doesn't because of the assumed intelligence of the listener. One example I cannot ever stop to bring up the inconsistency of these radio-friendly songs is Katy Perry's Last Friday Night, where she talks about a number of things she did last Friday night, including but not limited to having a menage a trois. Now, for the kids, and maybe even their parents, this phrase might go right over their heads, but if you gotta know, it's basically when two girls go down on a guy's dick at the same time. Yeah, I'm sure that's something the kids would love to be explained about awkwardly if they were even remotely curious. Another notable example of this oversight of censorship is Lou Reed's Walk on the Wild Side, where he refers to the backup singers as colored girls before the first break, completely uncut. Granted, the context he is referring to them is not demeaning, and the year this song came out would contextualize it as him using the then appropriate nomenclature for black people, but given that the word nigga is censored in any context of a given song, sort of invalidates the reason why this wouldn't have been. The second example that I briefly mentioned that radio-friendly songs get made is that they'll swap out a obscenity in favor of another that vaguely gets the same point across. The most notable example of this being used to its fullest is CeeLo Green's Fuck You, of which even the title of the song is changed to Forget You for the radio stations, as well as in the chorus where it's most mentioned. Most of the time, this services the finer point of the lyrics and or the song without an abrupt cut, but often this changeup can have mixed results. One example of this attempt to clean up a song only to be made dirtier is Ben Shapiro's favorite song, WAP, by Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion. The clean version of this song changes wet ass pussy to wet and gushy, making the song honestly more obscene than it already was, with the imagery of a woman's clit being gushy in any way as opposed to just being extremely wet. Beyond the fact that this song even cleaned up would not be appropriate for kids to listen to, this change-up ultimately fails in what it was trying to accomplish, all the while still very much alluding to things inappropriate for children. It gets even better though, because with this change-up in obscenity in mind, means that any song can talk about anything grotesque as long as you use wordplay to dance around the censors. An example I can think of is when Eminem briefly rapped in Pig Latin in Rap Game, but the most infamous one I can think of is Flo Rida's Whistle, where the entire song is a euphemism for performing a blowjob without directly mentioning it at all. And how exactly do the radio-friendly stations contend with this when the song by their own logic is radio-friendly simply because it doesn't say it? Does a song like Prison Song by Tool get by simply because it doesn't directly mention rape and sodomy in the American prison system? If it's simply made for the sake of the word and not what the word contextualizes, then again, songs like Monsters and Sober shouldn't be under this scrutiny for merely verbalizing a sentiment. But perhaps the worst offense about censored or radio-friendly songs comes when the song itself isn't consistent on what it deems offensive or not. Going back to Everclear's What It's Like, that song has perhaps the most schizophrenic of clean versions that I've seen. You might get lucky and find a clean version that does censor words like shit and fucking, or you might get a version that for some reason censors words like green and chrome 45. And if you're real unlucky, almost half of the words of this song will be censored with extremely annoying disc scratch sounds, and the reasons for them seem entirely inconsistent reasons compared to the other examples. Because, of course, mentioning smoking the finest green and pulling out his chrome 45 is alluding to weed and a gun, but like I just pointed out with Flo Rida's Whistle or Katy Perry's Last Friday Night, what the word contextualizes didn't matter for those songs, whereas here it does, and only some of the time. The finer point I'm trying to make about all this is that humans are a lot more intelligent than these radio-friendly stations can give credit to them. That we can easily pick up on euphemism, rearrange words that are misspelled or left out of context easily in our heads, and fill the blanks and read between the lines of meanings. In this pursuit of trying to protect the children with these songs, does it also infantilize the adults as a result, as though no one could pick up on the deeper meaning behind the lyrics of the songs, regardless of how much you take out of it? Of course, then comes the question, what would I do to remedy this? I think the easiest way to do so is to have stations that are completely censor-free, curse word and all, and stations that are smart enough to pick up on the subtext of a song that simply a change-up of lyrics won't avoid it from being on that list. In a similar veneer to what the YouTube Kids program does, where it's not merely enough that the video doesn't have obscenities, but that the subject matter is void of innuendo or darker imagery. Because being subjected to a song like Sam Smith's Unholy or Ariana Grande's 34-35, despite both being obscene or alluding to it on these so-called radio-friendly stations, is nothing short of selling me a white lie. Doesn't help that a lot of this is based on extremely antiquated notions that have barely updated past when the parental advisory sticker was a contentious thing back then, and that much of this decision making is cynically done to drive money rather than a concerted effort to protect kids, seeing as all the aforementioned examples are as they are regardless of context. And with this extremely spotty and inconsistent nature behind what is deemed clean will only cause discontent with its usage in future. The Panic at the Disco song I mentioned earlier, lately I've heard versions that don't cut out the word goddamn or the word whore in the first verse on radio-friendly stations, coming as a shock to me, and perhaps indicative of the same feeling that I have that these rules are arbitrarily enforced and rarely, if ever, consistent. And unless they do update their standards, will they continue to be loopholed to oblivion or to be thrown out, even if its intentions are pure.